The morning sun barely peeked through the thick gray clouds as Sarah Mitchell hurried down Maple Street, her threadbare jacket doing little to shield her from the bitter October wind. She was already 20 minutes late for her shift at the diner, and she knew Mrs. Henderson would dock her pay again. But she couldn't help it. The bus had broken down 3 blocks away, and she'd had to run the rest of the distance. Her worn sneakers, held together with duct tape on one side, splashed through puddles from last night's rain. Sarah was only 19, but life had already etched worry lines around her eyes. Ever since her mother had gotten sick 2 years ago, Sarah had been working 3 jobs just to keep them afloat. The medical bills kept piling up like autumn leaves, and no matter how hard she worked, they never seemed to get smaller. As she rushed past the old church on the corner, she nearly collided with someone. An elderly man stood at the edge of the busy intersection, his weathered hands gripping a wooden cane that had seen better days. He was trying to cross, but the morning traffic was relentless. Cars zoomed past without slowing, their drivers too focused on their phones or coffee cups to notice the old man's struggle. Sarah watched as the man took a tentative step forward, only to quickly step back as a truck roared by, honking angrily. The old man's shoulders sagged, and Sarah could see his hands, trembling whether from age or fear. She couldn't tell. She glanced at her watch. If she stopped to help, she'd definitely lose her job. Mrs. Henderson had warned her just yesterday. One more late arrival, and she was done. But then the old man tried again, and this time a car came so close that its side mirror nearly clipped him. Sarah's heart clenched. She thought of her own grandfather, who had passed away when she was 12. He used to tell her stories about kindness being the only real currency that mattered in life. Without another thought, Sarah jogged over to the man. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently, touching his elbow. "Can I help you across?" The old man turned to look at her, and Sarah was struck by his eyes bright blue, like pieces of sky trapped in a weathered face. He smiled, revealing gaps where teeth used to be. "That would be wonderful, dear," he said, his voice raspy, but warm. "These old legs aren't what they used to be, and these drivers, ... He shook his head sadly. Sarah took his arm, feeling how thin it was beneath his patched wool coat. Together, they waited for a break in traffic, then slowly made their way across. Cars honked impatiently, but Sarah kept her pace steady, matching the old man's shuffling steps. As they walked, Sarah noticed things about him that told a story of hardship. His shoes were held together with string, much like her own. His coat had been mended so many times that it was more patches than original fabric. Yet despite his apparent poverty, there was something dignified about him, something in the way he held his head high despite his circumstances. "Thank you, young lady," the man said when they reached the other side safely. "Not many people would stop these days. Everyone's always in such a hurry." Sarah smiled, though she was acutely aware of the minutes ticking by. "It's nothing, really. Are you okay to get where you're going?" The old man nodded, studying her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "You're late for something," he observed. "Yet you stopped anyway." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "It's just my job. I'll figure it out." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a business card, though it was so worn and faded that Sarah could barely make out the writing. "If you ever need anything," he said, pressing it into her hand, "you come find me at the Morrison farm, out on Route 47. Ask for George." Sarah accepted the card politely, though she doubted she'd ever use it. What could an old man who could barely afford decent shoes do to help her? But she thanked him anyway, and watched as he shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the hardware store. By the time Sarah burst through the diner's door, she was 35 minutes late. Mrs. Henderson was waiting, her arms crossed, and her face set in a scowl that could curdle milk. "That's it, Sarah," she said before Sarah could even explain. "I warned you yesterday. Clear out your locker." Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. Please, Mrs. Henderson, I can explain. There was an old man who needed help, but Mrs. Henderson had already turned away, dismissing her with a wave. I don't want to hear excuses. I've got a business to run. With trembling hands, Sarah collected her few belongings from the employee locker, a hairbrush, an extra pair of socks, and a photo of her and her mother from healthier times. As she walked out of the diner, the weight of her situation crashed down on her. Without this job, she couldn't make rent. Without rent money, she and her mother would be evicted. The downward spiral seemed inevitable now. She sat on the curb outside, her head in her hands, trying not to cry. That's when she remembered the card the old man had given her. She pulled it from her pocket, squinting at the faded text. Morrison Farm, Agricultural Operations, George Morrison, Proprietor. She almost laughed. What was she going to do? Ask an old farmer for a job? She didn't know the first thing about farming, but desperation has a way of making even the most unlikely options seem worth trying. The next morning, after spending a sleepless night worrying about bills and her mother's medication, Sarah caught the earliest bus out to Route 47. She had used her last $5 for the fare, telling herself it was an investment in possibility. The bus ride took 45 minutes, winding through parts of town she'd never seen before. The houses grew larger and farther apart, and eventually gave way to rolling fields and pastures. When the driver announced the stop for Morrison Farm, Sarah almost didn't get off. From the road, she could see the entrance's simple wooden gate with a hand-painted sign that had seen better days. This didn't look like a place that would be hiring, but she'd come this far. Sarah walked up the long gravel driveway, her worn sneakers crunching on the stones. The farmhouse came into view, a modest two-story structure that needed a new coat of paint. There were several barns and outbuildings, all showing their age. A few chickens pecked around the yard, and she could hear cows lowing somewhere in the distance. She knocked on the front door, her heart pounding. After a moment, it opened, and there stood the old man from yesterday, though he looked different somehow. He was wearing clean work clothes, and his posture seemed straighter. "Well, well," George Morrison said, his blue eyes twinkling. "I wondered if you'd come." Sarah shifted nervously. "Mr. Morrison, I lost my job yesterday because I stopped to help you. I know it's not your fault, but you said if I ever needed anything. I'm desperate. I need work. I'll do anything, glean barns, feed animals, whatever you need." George studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, dear. Let's talk." The inside of the farmhouse was simple but clean. Sarah noticed that despite the modest furnishings, everything was well maintained. George led her to the kitchen and poured her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. The warmth of the mug in her hands was comforting. "Tell me about yourself," George said, sitting across from her at the worn wooden table. Sarah hesitated, then found herself pouring out her story. She told him about her mother's illness, the mounting medical bills, the 3 jobs she'd been juggling, and how losing the diner job might mean losing everything. George listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know," he finally said, "I've been running this farm alone for 5 years now, ever since my Martha passed. I could use some help." Sarah's heart leaped. "Really? I have to warn you, I don't know anything about farming." George chuckled. "Neither did I, when I started 60 years ago. We learn by doing, dear. Can you start tomorrow? The pay isn't much, $15 an hour, but it's honest work." Sarah nearly cried with relief. It was more than she'd been making at the diner. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Morrison." As she stood to leave, George added, "And, Sarah, that kindness you showed yesterday, don't ever lose that. It's rarer than gold these days." Sarah started work at Morrison Farm the next day, arriving before sunrise. George was already up, making breakfast in the kitchen. He insisted she eat before starting scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon from his own animals. It was more food than she'd had in one sitting in months. The work was hard, but satisfying. George taught her how to feed the chickens, collect eggs, and milk the small herd of dairy cows. Her hands, soft from years of waitressing, quickly developed blisters, but she didn't complain. George was a patient teacher, showing her the rhythms of farm life with a gentleness that reminded her of her grandfather. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah noticed things about the farm that didn't quite add up. Despite its modest appearance, everything was of the highest quality. The animal feed was premium grade. The equipment, though old-looking, was actually top-of-the-line machinery painted to look worn. And sometimes, she'd catch George on the phone, discussing what sounded like major business deals in terms she didn't understand. One afternoon, while cleaning the barn, Sarah discovered a room she hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, she could see filing cabinets and a desk covered with papers. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she peered closer. What she saw made her gasp. There were contracts for agricultural supplies worth millions of dollars, land deeds for properties all over the county, and bank statements showing numbers that made her head spin. George Morrison wasn't just a farmer, he was apparently one of the wealthiest agricultural businessmen in the state. Quite a shock, isn't it? George's voice came from behind her. Sarah jumped, spinning around with her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to snoop." The door was open and George held up a hand, smiling. "It's all right, dear. I suppose you would have found out eventually." Sarah was confused, and a little hurt. Why the pretense? Why act like you're just a poor old farmer? George's expression grew serious. He gestured for her to sit on a hay bale, then sat beside her with a heavy sigh. 40 years ago, I was just a poor farmer, barely scraping by. But I had an idea for a new irrigation system that could triple crop yields. Everyone laughed at me, said I was a fool. But I persisted, worked 18-hour days, and eventually, it paid off. That system is now used on farms across the country. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. As the money came in, everything changed. People who had ignored me suddenly wanted to be my friend. Family members I hadn't heard from in years showed up with their hands out. I couldn't tell anymore who liked me for me and who just wanted my money. So about 10 years ago, I decided to live simply. I kept the old farmhouse, wore regular clothes, and only did business through my lawyers and managers. I wanted to see who would still show kindness to George Morrison the man, not George Morrison the millionaire. Sarah absorbed this information, her mind reeling. "So yesterday, when you were trying to cross the street, double quotes, George nodded. I could have called my driver. I have several, but I wanted to walk, to be part of the world again. And then I couldn't cross that intersection, and car after car just went by, until you stopped." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You were testing people." George shook his head quickly. "No, dear, not testing. Just observing, living, being human. And you reminded me that there are still good people in this world. People who help others not for reward, but because it's right." He stood up, pacing to the barn door and looking out at his fields. "I'm getting old, Sarah. I have no children, no family left. All this," he gestured at the farm, "will outlive me, but without purpose. It's just property and money. I've been thinking about what to do with it all." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she remained quiet. George turned back to her. "How? Would you like to learn the business side of farming? Not just the physical work, but the contracts, the negotiations, the agricultural science. I could teach you everything I know." Sarah was stunned. "Mr. Morrison, I am just a high school graduate. I don't have any business experience." George's eyes twinkled. "Neither did I when I started, but you have something more valuable: integrity. You helped an old man when you had everything to lose. That tells me more about your character than any resume could." Over the following months, Sarah's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. George became not just her employer, but her mentor, teaching her about sustainable farming, business management, and agricultural innovation. He paid for her to take online courses in business and agriculture, and introduced her to his network of suppliers and buyers, though always presenting her as his assistant, never revealing his true wealth to maintain their simple facade. Sarah moved her mother into a small cottage on the farm property, where the fresh air and peaceful surroundings seemed to improve her health. George would often join them for dinner, and the three of them formed an unlikely family. Sarah's mother, unaware of George's wealth, would fuss over him, mending his clothes and cooking his favorite meals, treating him like the father she'd never had. The truth about George's identity remained a secret in the broader community. To everyone in town, he was still just old George Morrison, the farmer who needed help crossing streets. But Sarah knew the truth. He was a man who had chosen kindness over ostentation, connection over isolation. She watched him conduct million-dollar deals over the phone while wearing overalls and muddy boots, saw him donate anonymously to local charities, and observed how he tested the character of every business associate by meeting them first as a simple farmer. One evening, as autumn turned to winter, George called Sarah into his study. This time, the door was wide open, the room no longer a secret. He handed her a thick envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it," he said, his eyes serious. Inside were legal documents that made Sarah's hands shake. George was making her a full partner in Morrison Agricultural Enterprises, with a significant ownership stake in the business. "Mr. Morrison, I can't accept this. It's too much." George took her hands in his weathered ones. "Sarah, in all my years of business, I've learned that money is just a tool. It's what we do with it that matters. You've shown me that you understand this. You stopped to help an old man not knowing he could reward you. You've worked hard not for the promise of inheritance, but because you take pride in your work. You treat everyone with respect, from the delivery drivers to the bank presidents." He squeezed her hands gently. "I won't live forever, dear, but knowing that this farm, this business, will be in the hands of someone who values kindness over profit, who sees the humanity in everyone, that gives me peace." Sarah wiped away tears. "You've already given me so much. A job when I was desperate, a home for my mother, an education, and you," George interrupted, "gave me something money could never buy. You reminded me that genuine human connection is worth more than all the wealth in the world. You gave me a family again." As winter settled over the farm, Sarah continued to learn and grow under George's guidance. She implemented new sustainable farming practices she'd learned in her courses, started a program to employ other struggling young people from town, and began developing plans for a community garden where low-income families could grow their own food. The secret of George's wealth gradually became known, as these things do in small towns. But by then, Sarah had proven herself capable and compassionate in equal measure. The same people who might have dismissed her as just a poor girl who got lucky now respected her for her innovation and dedication. Mrs. Henderson from the diner even came by one day, hat in hand, asking if there might be work available. Sarah hired her to run the farm store they'd opened, choosing grace over grudge. George watched all of this with pride, knowing he'd made the right choice. 5 years passed, and Sarah had grown from a desperate girl barely making ends meet into a confident businesswoman who never forgot her roots. The farm had expanded, implementing cutting-edge sustainable practices that attracted attention from agricultural journals and universities. But more importantly, it had become a beacon of hope in the community, employing dozens of people who, like Sarah, just needed a chance. George's health began to decline, as age eventually demands its due. On a quiet, spring morning, with Sarah holding his hand, He passed peacefully in the farmhouse where he'd spent so many years. The funeral was attended by hundreds, not because George Morrison was wealthy, but because he had touched so many lives through his quiet acts of kindness. Sarah discovered after his death that George had been secretly paying medical bills for families in need, funding scholarships for local students, and ensuring that no family in the county went hungry. All done anonymously, all done without expectation of recognition. In his will, George left the bulk of his estate to Sarah, with instructions to use it to help others cross their own difficult intersections. The remainder was distributed among various charities and a trust fund for Sarah's mother's continued care. But the most precious thing he left her wasn't money or property, it was a letter. Sarah read it alone, sitting in the barn where they'd had so many conversations. "Dear Sarah," it began, "that morning you helped me cross the street. You thought you were helping a poor old man, but I was the one who was poor in spirit, isolated by my own success, forgotten by a world that valued what I had over who I was. You gave me 5 more years of feeling truly alive, truly connected, truly human. You showed me that my wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others up." The letter continued, "Never forget that moment of kindness that brought us together. In a world that often rewards selfishness, you chose selflessness. That single act rippled outward, changing not just your life and mine, but the lives of everyone this farm will touch in the years to come. Keep crossing streets with those who need help. Keep seeing the humanity in everyone you meet. Keep choosing kindness even when it costs you something. Because in the end, that's the only real wealth we have, the good we do for others." Sarah folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket next to the faded business card she still carried, the one George had given her that first day. She walked out of the barn and looked across the thriving farm, where employees were tending to crops that would feed thousands, where the community garden bloomed with vegetables for families in need, where a new training center was being built to teach sustainable farming to the next generation. She thought about that morning years ago, when she had been just a poor girl who helped an old man cross the street, unaware he was the town's richest farmer. That simple act of kindness had changed everything. But George had taught her something more valuable than business or farming. He had shown her that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or acres, but in the lives we touch and the kindness we spread. Every person we help cross their own difficult intersection might be carrying hidden gifts, hidden pain, or hidden potential. We never know what a single act of kindness might grow into. As the sun set over Morrison Farm, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go into town wearing simple clothes, her identity as the new owner of Morrison Agricultural Enterprises hidden. She would walk the streets, ride the bus, shop at the small stores, and if she saw someone who needed help, whether crossing a street, carrying groceries, or just needing someone to listen, she would stop. Because George had taught her that sometimes the poorest-looking people are the richest in spirit, and sometimes the richest people are the poorest in what really matters. And sometimes, when a poor girl helps an old man cross the street, unaware he is the town's richest farmer, magic happens. Not the magic of fairy tales, but the real magic of human connection. Of kindness recognized and multiplied, of lives transformed. Through simple acts of love, the farm would continue to grow, the business would continue to thrive, but Sarah would never forget the lesson at the heart of it all. We are all just people trying to cross difficult intersections, and sometimes, all we need is someone to take our arm and walk beside us. Sometimes the smallest gesture creates the biggest change. Sometimes kindness is its own reward, but sometimes, just sometimes, it opens doors we never knew existed. As Sarah walked back to the farmhouse, she passed the spot where she'd first discovered George's secret. She smiled, remembering her shock and confusion. Now she understood. Wealth wasn't about hiding who you are, or showing off what you have. It was about using whatever you possessed, whether millions, or just a moment of time, to make someone else's journey a little easier. The story of the poor girl who helped an old man cross the street, unaware he was the town's richest farmer, became legend in their small town. Parents told it to their children as a bedtime story about kindness. Teachers used it as a lesson about not judging by appearances. But for Sarah, it wasn't just a story. It was a reminder that every person we meet might be fighting battles we know nothing about, might be carrying secrets we can't imagine, might be angels in disguise, testing our character. Years later, when Sarah had grown old herself, she would still walk the streets of town, helping where she could. Young people would assist her, not knowing she was the wealthy owner of the county's largest agricultural enterprise, and she would smile, remembering George, and plant seeds of kindness that would grow in ways those young people couldn't yet imagine. Because that's how kindness works. It multiplies, it spreads, it transforms. One moment of choosing to help, despite our own struggles, can change not just one life, but countless lives. The intersection where Sarah had helped George became a symbol in the town, with a small plaque installed years later that simply read, "Sometimes angels come disguised as those in need, and sometimes as those who help." The Morrison farm grew into Morrison Agricultural Foundation, helping small farmers across the state, providing food for food banks, and funding agricultural education for underprivileged youth. But at its heart, it remained what George had envisioned, a testament to the power of simple human kindness. Sarah never forgot that she had once been a poor girl, struggling to survive, and she made sure the foundation always had programs for those in similar situations. Every year on the anniversary of that fateful morning, she would stand at the same intersection and help whoever needed to cross, whether they were old, young, rich, or poor. Sometimes former employees would join her, people whose lives had been changed by the chance she'd given them. They would share stories of how one opportunity had led to another, how kindness had been passed forward, how the ripples continued to spread. The local newspaper once asked Sarah for the secret to her success. She pulled out the faded business card George had given her that first day, now laminated and worn from years of carrying it. "The secret," she said, "is understanding that success isn't about what you achieve for yourself, but what you enable others to achieve." George Morrison taught me that when we help others cross their difficult intersections, we often find that we're the ones who end up on the other side of something amazing. The reporter wanted more, wanted financial strategies and business tips. But Sarah just smiled and said, "A poor girl helped an old man cross the street, unaware he was the town's richest farmer." Everything else grew from that single moment of choosing kindness over convenience. That's all the strategy anyone really needs. As she spoke, Sarah noticed a young woman at the nearby bus stop, counting coins in her palm with a worried expression, clearly short of fare. Sarah excused herself from the interview and walked over, pulling a bus pass from her pocket. "Here," she said, "take this. It's good for the whole month." The young woman's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude, reminding Sarah so much of herself all those years ago. "I can't accept this," the young woman protested. "It's too much." Sarah pressed the pass into her hand. "Then pass it on when you're able. Help someone else cross their intersection." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and boarded the bus. Sarah didn't tell her who she was, didn't mention the farm or the foundation. She just waved as the bus pulled away, knowing that somewhere, sometime, that kindness would bloom into something beautiful. Because that's what George had taught her. That true wealth isn't what we accumulate, but what we distribute. Not what we achieve, but what we enable. Not what we gain, but what we give. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the intersection where it all began. Sarah stood there for a moment, remembering a frightened 19-year-old girl who had risked her job to help a stranger. She could never have imagined where that choice would lead. Couldn't have dreamed of the lives that would be touched, the community that would be transformed. But that's the mystery and magic of kindness. We never know where it will lead. Hey, poor girl helped an old man cross the street, unaware he was the town's richest farmer. And in that simple act, she discovered that the greatest riches aren't measured in money, but in the moments we choose love over fear, generosity over greed, and kindness over convenience. The story continues still, in every act of kindness, every extended hand, every moment when someone chooses to help another cross their difficult intersection. Because we are all, in our own ways, both the poor girl and the rich farmer, both the helper and the helped, both the one who gives and the one who receives. And in the